Across America's heartland, soybean farmers are staring at empty silos and uncertain futures. China, once the biggest buyer of U.S. soybeans, has suddenly cut orders to near zero, leaving billions of dollars worth of crops unsold. For generations, these farmers fed both the nation and the world, but now they face mounting debts, falling prices, and the looming threat of bankruptcy. All eyes are on Washington, where trade tensions with Beijing have turned family farms into battlegrounds of economic warfare. As global competitors rush to replace U.S. exports, America's farmers walk a tightrope, waiting desperately for a trade deal that could decide whether they survive or lose everything they've built. America's soybean farmers are facing a crisis unlike anything they've seen in decades. For years, China has been the single largest buyer of U.S. soybeans, purchasing billions of dollars worth each season to feed its massive livestock industry. But this year, the orders have all but vanished. Beijing has sharply cut back on U.S. imports, citing ongoing trade tensions, retaliatory tariffs, and a growing push to source soybeans from other suppliers like Brazil and Argentina. The impact on U.S. farmers has been immediate and severe. Across states like Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, silos are filled with unsold crops, while market prices plunge to record lows. Many farmers, already reeling from droughts, rising fuel costs, and pandemic-era disruptions, say they simply cannot survive another season without stable export markets. Some have taken second jobs or dipped into savings just to keep family farms afloat. Local farming associations warn that the loss of Chinese buyers could drive smaller operations out of business entirely. "We've built decades of trade relationships with China," one Iowa farmer said. "Now it feels like we're pawns in a trade war we didn't start." At the same time, Brazil has stepped in to fill the void, exporting record soybean shipments to China while U.S. farmers watch helplessly from the sidelines. Washington has promised aid packages and subsidies, but experts say these are only short-term fixes. The stakes are growing by the day. Without a new trade agreement, America's agricultural heartland could face long-term economic damage that reshapes rural communities for generations. The U.S.-China soybean trade once symbolized economic cooperation between the two superpowers. For decades, American farmers supplied China with millions of tons of soybeans each year, making it one of the most valuable agricultural export relationships in the world. At its peak, China purchased over 60% of all U.S. soybean exports, fueling its booming livestock and poultry industries. But everything changed when trade tensions erupted in 2018. Washington imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, accusing Beijing of unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft. In response, China hit back with its own tariffs, targeting American agriculture directly. Soybeans became the primary casualty, with Chinese buyers canceling U.S. orders almost overnight. The Trump administration introduced subsidy programs to compensate farmers for lost sales, but these payments couldn't replace the long-term contracts and relationships that had taken decades to build. Meanwhile, China pivoted to other suppliers, particularly Brazil, which quickly became the top soybean exporter to the Chinese market. As the trade war dragged on, U.S. farmers found themselves stuck in the middle, caught between geopolitical rivalries and global market shifts they couldn't control. Even after partial trade deals were signed, purchases from China never fully recovered, leaving American agriculture vulnerable to every new round of tariffs and political tensions. The economic fallout from China cutting U.S. soybean orders has been swift and brutal. Farm incomes across the Midwest have plunged, with many small and mid-sized family farms facing bankruptcy. Soybean prices, once a reliable source of profit, have collapsed under the weight of record-high inventories and shrinking export markets. Equipment dealers report declining sales as farmers delay buying new tractors and machinery. Rural banks warn of rising loan defaults as farmers struggle to repay debts tied to last year's crop cycles. Politically, the crisis is intensifying pressure on Washington. Lawmakers from agricultural states accuse federal trade negotiators of turning farmers into collateral damage in a geopolitical showdown. Bipartisan calls for new trade agreements are growing louder, with some members of Congress demanding targeted relief programs to prevent a full-scale rural economic collapse. Meanwhile, China's pivot toward Brazil and other suppliers has shifted global trade patterns, raising fears that U.S. farmers may permanently lose market share even if relations improve later. Economists warn that rebuilding trust with Chinese buyers could take years, especially as Beijing invests heavily in alternative sources and domestic production. For many American farmers, the crisis isn't just about economics, it's about survival. The U.S.-China soybean standoff has triggered major shifts in global agricultural trade, creating both winners and losers on the world stage. Brazil, already a top soybean exporter, has been the biggest beneficiary by far. With China desperate for reliable suppliers, Brazilian farmers have expanded production at record speed, clearing millions of acres for soybean cultivation and exporting unprecedented volumes to Chinese ports. Argentina, Paraguay, and even Ukraine are also stepping in to fill the gap left by U.S. farmers. These countries see the trade war as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to lock in long-term contracts with the world's largest soybean consumer. As a result, global supply chains are being rewired, with investment dollars flowing into South American infrastructure, new rail lines, port facilities, and storage silos designed to handle soaring export volumes. Meanwhile, international grain markets have grown increasingly volatile. Prices swing wildly as traders react to every headline about U.S.-China negotiations. Some countries, like Russia, are exploring soybean expansion to diversify their agricultural exports, while others, like India, watch closely for potential opportunities in niche markets. For the United States, these global reactions carry a grim warning. Once competitors establish themselves as China's primary suppliers, winning back lost market share could prove nearly impossible. As the U.S.-China soybean standoff drags on, the future of America's agricultural heartland hangs in the balance. Farmers across the Midwest say they need more than temporary subsidies or political promises. They need stable, long-term access to export markets. Many are calling on Washington to prioritize agricultural trade in any future negotiations with China, warning that rural economies cannot survive another season of uncertainty. Agricultural leaders also want trade agreements that protect them from becoming bargaining chips in unrelated political disputes. Some advocate for diversified export strategies, expanding sales to Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to reduce dependence on any single buyer. Others urge federal investment in domestic biofuel programs to absorb surplus soybeans when foreign demand collapses. Economists warn that even if a new trade deal is signed, U.S. farmers may face a long road to recovery. Brazil and other countries now have a firm foothold in the Chinese market, and Beijing is unlikely to reverse course completely. Rebuilding relationships, securing contracts, and restoring price stability could take years, time many small farmers simply don't have. Still, agricultural groups remain hopeful. They argue that with the right policies, the U.S. can reclaim its role as a global agricultural powerhouse. But without decisive action soon, America's soybean belt risks losing its competitive edge for good. America's soybean farmers now stand at a crossroads. Once the backbone of U.S. agricultural exports, they face a future clouded by uncertainty, mounting debt, and shrinking markets. As China turns to Brazil and other suppliers, Washington must decide whether to prioritize trade deals that protect rural economies or risk watching generations of family farms disappear. For many farmers, this crisis isn't about politics. It's about survival, livelihoods, and the legacy of American agriculture itself. The world is watching closely. Will the U.S. rebuild trust with its largest buyers or lose its agricultural dominance forever? For more updates on global trade, markets, and economic news, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.